Hey guys, we really miss you and hope you're all doing well. Just here to bring you a message from Colossians 2 today. Whenever you're watching it, we're thinking of you and praying for you. And we put a link in the description for a video to listen to someone reading Colossians 2. So if you haven't had a chance to read it already, go ahead now, pause this video, and find the link to Streetlights in the comments. Okay, so we learned last week from Tara that this letter to the Colossians was written by Paul, and he was writing from prison to this new kind of young church at Colossae, trying to correct some of their confusion from being a young church and hearing from false teachers. In chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, Paul is kind of continuing from chapter 1, explaining to them that he wants them to know the true gospel so that no one will deceive you with well-crafted arguments. Then he moves on in verse 6 and on to talk about some of those well-crafted arguments or potentially ways they might have been tempted to add to the gospel at the church at Colossae. I learned a little bit about the context here. Colossian Christians were living in a context where there was confusion and pressure on all sides from a variety of different belief systems. Colossians typically worshipped Greek or Roman gods and goddesses, but there was also a large Jewish population in the area that followed strict moral codes and rules. There was lots of mixing of religious beliefs and everything from belief in magic, astrology, and pagan worship that was sometimes violent. On top of all of this, false teachers had come into their church and sort of added to that confusion. You can hear Paul talking about some of these things in verses 4, 8, 15, 16, and others when he talks about spiritual rulers and authorities, spiritual powers of this world, and rules that the Colossians are continuing to follow, even though they've already been freed by Jesus.
Yeah, so like Bethany mentioned, all of this created a lot of fear and confusion for the Colossians. So there was fear of these deities, there was fear of the Jewish groups, there was fear of the culture, there was just a lot of judgment and a lot of expectations and mixed messages that were coming in for the Colossians that Paul is trying to clear up. And so at the end of the chapter, Paul reminds them that Christ has already set them free. He says that when you accepted Christ, you were buried with him and you were raised to new life with him, and he forgave them of all of their sins. He forgave us of all of our sins. So don't let anyone condemn you. God's saying that if I forgive you, which I did, no one else can step in and say, well, actually you're condemned, or actually you're not enough yet, or actually you need to add this to what Jesus did. Yeah. So if this is true, Paul's saying, so why do you keep following the rules of this world? As though they mean anything. And he says something really profound at the end of the chapter. He says, these rules may seem wise. People that do things that are really strict or seem like they take a lot of discipline that might seem wise, but he says they provide no help in conquering a person's evil desires. So Jesus isn't just after us conforming to outward expectations, which a lot of these things that were put on them were, but he's saying, I want to transform you from the inside out. So you can follow all these rules, whether they be religious rules or cultural rules or other religious rules, but those really don't have any value, and Jesus has already set you free. So maybe you can relate to this if you look at older generations or and just like kind of the strict rules that were followed, or like maybe you have to dress a certain way, or you have to talk a certain way, or you can't do this, or you can't do that. Right. And not just that there aren't things that we should follow in life, but there are like these things you have to add to Jesus in order to be a Christian or to be accepted by God. But Paul offers a better way. In verses 6 through 8, he says, and now, just as you accepted Christ as your Lord, you must continue to follow him. Let your roots grow down into him and let your lives be built on him. Then your faith will grow strong in the truth you were taught, and you will overflow with thankfulness. So Jesus isn't just the ticket into the game. He is the whole game of life, meaning like I think so. I grew up in the church, and I think I had this idea that Jesus died for me. And when I accepted that, that was like, all right, I'm good for heaven now. But like, how do I live as a Christian? I got to do all these other things, or I have to like do things to add to Jesus. Like he was the ticket in. He was kind of like the bare minimum, but now I need to like prove myself to God and to all these to other people apart from Jesus. And Paul's saying, no, like you can't add to Jesus. Like just as you accepted him, that's how you also live your life following Jesus. So there's no such thing as Jesus and, it's just Jesus and more Jesus. So we have a few discussion questions. Actually, sorry. So verse 10, I'll end with this. So it says, he gives a really good reminder. He says, you are complete already with Christ. And so that's just reaffirming, like, you don't need to add things already. Like, you're already complete with what Jesus has done. Now we have discussion questions.
So if we had, like, one main message today, it would basically be, you're already complete and you are already enough in Jesus. So maybe that's enough for you and you can just kind of go and sit with that. But we have a few discussion questions to kind of help you reflect on that more. So question number 1, what are some ways that you feel you need to add to Jesus to be accepted or to be a Christian? Sort of, what is your Jesus and? Jesus and what? Like good grades, thought rule following, like whatever it is for you that is Jesus and.
Yep.
And then
number 2 is what is one way you can focus on Jesus and that your roots grow deep in him this week? So kind of how do you reorient from not like how can you conform to some outward thing, but what is a practical thing you can do to think about, like, how am I growing my roots deep in Jesus? So
thanks, guys.
we love you guys. We miss you.